Da was a quiet, peaceful place, its sky painted in hues of violet and gold as twin suns set over rolling fields of bioluminescent flora. The colony had existed in harmony for centuries, untouched by war, and prepared for violence. That peace shattered in an instant. The first explosions tore through the outer defenses with terrifying efficiency, sending plumes of smoke into the sky. The Raidens descended like a storm, their blackened ships blotting out the stars as they streaked toward the surface, weapons primed. The small and fragile creatures with glimmering silver eyes and delicate, translucent skin had no means to fight back. They were scientists, poets, builders of beauty, not warriors. Their elders ushered the younglings toward the underground shelters, whispering words of comfort even as their voices trembled with fear. Sergeant Daniel Briggs stood at the colony's central outpost, fingers tightening around the rifle slung across his chest. He had been stationed here as a military advisor, tasked with assessing the planet's defenses, not that it had any to begin with. His orders had been clear: observe, report, do not engage. The United Terran Federation had yet to decide if they were worth the trouble of military intervention, and Briggs had been sent as nothing more than a formality. But as he stood there, watching the Raidens sweep through the village, setting fire to homes, ripping families apart, and dragging helpless civilians from their dwellings, something inside him boiled over. His heart pounded as he saw a group of Raidens advancing toward a cluster of younglings huddled beneath the ruins of a fallen archway, their wide eyes filled with terror. He was trained to follow orders, but orders be damned. Briggs moved before his brain even had time to process the decision. His boots pounded against the cracked earth as he sprinted forward, dropping to one knee and raising his rifle in a single fluid motion. The first shot rang out, tearing through the armor of the leading Raiden, sending the towering brute crumpling to the ground. A heartbeat later, the second shot took down another. The remaining Raidens span, surprised, their cruel laughter fading as they took in the sight before them, a lone human standing between them and their prey. One of the, a scarred warrior with jagged tusks, bared his teeth in what might have been amusement. "When human," he snarled, stepping forward. "You should have stayed out of this, ape. Now you die with them." Briggs didn't answer. He had no words for them, only action. His rifle flared again, and the lead barely had time to process what happened before his body jerked backward. A neat hole punched through his forehead. The others roared, charging as plasma fire erupted around him. Briggs dived behind a fallen transport, rolling into cover as bolts of energy scorched the air where he had stood moments before. He could hear the younglings whimpering behind him, their small bodies pressed against the rubble, too terrified to move. He needed to end this and fast. Switching his rifle to, Briggs popped out of cover, unleashing a hailstorm of rounds. They were armored, but they weren't prepared for human precision. Each shot found its mark, cutting down the Raidens one by one. He was outnumbered, but he fought like a man possessed, his training kicking in as he moved with deadly efficiency. One of the warriors managed to close the distance, swinging a massive plasma axe. Briggs ducked, feeling the heat of the weapon sear the air above his head. He countered with a swift uppercut, driving his combat knife deep into the Raiden's exposed neck. The alien gurgled, collapsing in a heap. For a moment, silence. Then, the sound of more boots, more Raidens. Briggs exhaled sharply, shaking the sweat from his brow. He was just getting started. The scent of burning structures and scorched earth filled the air as Briggs reloaded his rifle, his ears tuned to the approaching footsteps of more Raidens. They weren't retreating, not yet. They had underestimated him, thinking a lone human wouldn't pose a threat. That mistake had already cost them, but they were too stubborn or too bloodthirsty to see it. Their war cries echoed through the ruins as they advanced, weapons drawn, their hulking forms outlined against the flickering fires of the settlement. Briggs exhaled, steadying his pulse. His body ached from an exertion, but he pushed it aside. He had work to do. The younglings behind him trembled, their silver eyes darting between him and the oncoming warriors. They had never seen this kind of brutality before, never imagined someone would stand and fight for them, not when surrender was the only logical outcome. But Briggs wasn't built for surrender. He had learned long ago that sometimes, you had to make a stand, no matter the odds. He glanced back at the children. Stay down. Stay quiet. No matter what. They nodded frantically, their small limbs pulling tighter together as if they could will themselves to disappear. The first Raiden burst through the smoke, a brutish thing with 4 arms, each clutching a serrated blade meant for carving through flesh and bone. He barely had time to register Briggs before a single shot drilled through his chest, sending him sprawling. More followed, a wave of armored figures surging forward with snarling confidence. Briggs dropped to one knee, firing rapidly, each round placed with surgical precision. They were used to conquering, used to breaking weaker civilizations with fear and brute force. But war had shaped humanity into something else. Where they relished chaos, humans had learned to master it. Briggs shifted, using the terrain to his advantage, moving between cover ponds, forcing his enemies into choke ponds where their numbers became meaningless. Plasma bolts hissed past him, slamming into stone and metal, sending shards flying. A shot grazed his shoulder, burning through fabric and flesh, but he didn't slow down. Pain was a distant thing, irrelevant when survival was on the line. He dropped another Raiden with a bust to the chest, then pivoted, drawing his sidearm as another charged. A single round punched through the alien's skull. He fell without a sound. The commandant, larger than the rest, stepped forward, his crimson armor glinting in the dim light. He carried an energy blade crackling with raw power, his eyes locking onto Briggs with a predator's focus. You fight like a cornered beast, human, he growled. But even beasts bleed. He lunged, the blade slicing through the air with lethal intent. Briggs barely dodged, rolling beneath the strike, feeling the heat of the weapon pass dangerously close. He came up fast, slamming the butt of his rifle into the commandant's jaw. The alien staggered but recovered quickly, swinging again. This time, Briggs caught his wrist, twisting sharply, forcing the blade away before driving his knee into the gut. They grappled, strength against skill, the commandant using his sheer size to force Briggs backward. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs as the alien loomed over him. The energy blade hummed as it was raised for a killing blow. Briggs reacted on instinct, yanking his combat knife from his belt and driving it upward into the exposed joint between the alien's ribs. The commandant stiffened, eyes wide in shock as Briggs twisted the blade deeper. The alien gurgled, trying to speak, but only blood came. With a final shove, Briggs rolled the body of him, gasping for breath. Silence settled over the battlefield. The remaining hesitated, their confidence shaken. A single human had turned through their ranks, had killed their leader in brutal, efficient combat. Briggs stood slowly, bloodied but unbroken, leveling his rifle at the survivors. Run! His voice was cold, final. The hardened warriors who had never known fear turned and fled into the darkness. Briggs exhaled sharply, his hands finally steadying. He turned back to the younglings, their wide eyes staring at him in awe. It's over, he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. They would regroup, but he had bought them time. That was enough. For now. Smoke and ash clung to the air as Briggs moved through the ruins, his rifle lowered but still ready. They had retreated for now, but he knew better than to assume they were gone for good. Predators like them never truly backed down unless they had no other choice. His muscles ached, wounds stinging from earlier fights, but there was no time for rest. The younglings followed closely behind, their silver eyes wide with fear and awe. They had never seen a warrior like him before, someone who stood against impossible odds not because he had to, but because he chose to. That choice weighed on him, heavier than any armor. The settlement was barely standing. Towers now lay in rubble, walls shattered by the relentless assault. Bodies, both and littered the streets. The air carried the acrid stench of plasma buns, mixed with the sickly sweetness of charred flesh. It was the smell of war, Van Bruggs knew all too well. He scanned the area, searching for survivors, his ears tuned for any sign of movement beyond the flickering fires and shifting debris. They clung to each other, their small frames barely visible in the wreckage. He crouched down, his voice softer than it had been in battle. We need to keep moving. There could be more of them. One of the younglings, a small girl with delicate, translucent markings across her forehead, stepped forward hesitantly. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried through the silence. Why did you stay and fight for us? The others looked at him, their expressions mirroring her question. Bruggs let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. He had fought for a lot of things in his life. His home, his people, his survival. But this was different. He had seen too many planets ravaged by war. Too many lives snuffed out because no one had been there to stand in the way. Because someone had to, he finally said. Because bullies like the don't stop until someone makes them. He looked each of them in the eye, making sure they understood. And because you deserved a chance to live. A soft, uncertain murmur ran through the group. They had expected to be abandoned. The galaxy had taught them that no one outside their kind would fight for them, that mercy was a fleeting thing. And yet, here stood a human, covered in blood and dirt, who had fought with a fury they had never witnessed before. Bruggs shook his head, standing. We're not safe yet. We need to find shelter, somewhere defensible. He motioned for them to follow, leading them through the broken streets toward what was left of the settlement's outer perimeter. As they moved, a flicker of movement in the rubble caught his eye. Instantly, his rifle was up, sights trained on the shifting debris. A groan followed, weak but unmistakably alive. Briggs moved swiftly, peeling away chunks of fallen stone until he uncovered the sailors, a male, olden, his robes torn and stained with blood. His breathing was ragged, and his golden eyes fluttered open as Briggs pulled him free. Eldon, one of the younglings gasped, rushing to his side. The Eldon coughed, his voice strained. You are human. His gaze flickered between Briggs and the younglings. You protected them. Briggs nodded, offering the man his canteen. The Eldon took a slow sip, wincing as he adjusted himself. It seems the stories about your kind do not do you justice. Briggs let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, I get that a lot. He looked around, knowing time was slipping away. They might have fled, but that didn't mean they wouldn't return with reinforcements. He turned back to the Eldon. We need to move. There's got to be somewhere we can hold out until help arrives. The Eldon nodded weakly, gesturing toward the north. There is an old communications outpost buried deep in the cliffs. It may still function. Briggs looked toward the horizon, spotting the jagged formations in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was better than staying out in the open. He helped the Eldon to his feet, then glanced at the younglings. All right, let's go. Stay close, stay quiet, and if I say run, you run. They nodded, newfound trust evident in their eyes. As they made their way toward the cliffs, Briggs couldn't shake the feeling that this fight wasn't over. He had sent a message today, loud and clear. They had learned that humans weren't to be trifled with. But he knew enemies like them, knew they would return, angrier, deadlier. He glanced at the trailing behind him, their fates now tied to his. He had started this fight, and he would see it through, whatever it took. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. Smoke still curled from the ruins of the settlement, drifting lazily into the twilight sky. The ground was littered with the aftermath of battle, scorch marks from plasma fire, shattered weapons, and the lifeless forms of those who had dared to stand in Briggs' way. He stood at the entrance of the old communications outpost, his rifle lowered but his eyes still scanning the distance. The younglings huddled inside the dimly lit bunker, their silver eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and reverence. They had seen war before, had lived through occupation and fear, but they had never seen what true fury looked like, until today. Briggs exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. His body ached, his wounds still fresh from the relentless fight to get here. His armor was scorched and dented, the surface marred by the desperate struggle for survival. He had been outnumbered, outgunned, and yet he had stood his ground. Not because he had to, not because it was his war, but because leaving innocents to die was not something he could abide. Inside the bunker, the Elden sat against the cold metal walls, his breathing still labored. Briggs had patched him up as best as he could, but the old man needed proper medical care. The communications array in the outpost had been damaged in the siege, leaving them stranded, cut off from the outside world. Briggs was no engineer, but he had managed to a distress signal, sending out a call to any friendly forces that might be listening. Now all they could do was wait. One of the younglings approached him cautiously. It was the same girl who had asked why he had fought for them. She clutched a small piece of torn fabric, part of his uniform, burned and frayed from the batter. "You could have left," she said quietly. "You could have saved yourself." Briggs gave a tired chuckle, crouching down so they were eye level. "Yeah, I could have," he admitted. "But I didn't." She hesitated, her small fingers gripping the fabric tightly. "Why?" He glanced back at the others, children who had lost their families, their homes, their sense of safety. He thought of Earth, of the long history of humanity's battles, of the countless times they had been underestimated. "Because I've seen what happens when no one stands up," he said finally. "I've seen what happens when the strong do nothing while the weak suffer. And I'll be damned if I let that happen again." She studied him for a long moment before nodding solemnly. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and hugged him. It was awkward, unexpected. Briggs tensed for a moment before sighing and patting her lightly on the back. All right, he muttered, clearing his throat. "I'm not dead yet, kid." A sudden noise cut through the quiet, a distant hum, growing louder by the second. Briggs shot to his feet, rifle raised, scanning the horizon. The younglings shrank back, fear creeping into their wide eyes. The Elden struggled to sit up. "Mo?" Briggs narrowed his gaze. No, the sound was different. The engines had a heavier timbre, a deeper roar. He knew that sound. A moment later, the sky split open as drop ships descended, their hulls bearing the unmistakable insignia of the Terran defense fleet. Searchlights flickered on, cutting through the haze. The distant crackle of radio chatter filled the air. The younglings peeked out from the bunker as the first of the drop ships touched down, kicking up a storm of dust and debris. Armed soldiers in Terran beta armor disembarked, weapons ready, eyes scanning for hostiles. When they spotted Briggs standing alone in front of the bunker, battered but unbowed, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, their commanding officer, a grizzled colonel with a scar running down the side of his face, stepped forward. "Briggs," the colonel muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "We picked up a distress call and expected a massacre. Instead, we find you here, alive, and apparently having wiped out a damn raiding force on your own." Briggs wiped the grime from his face with the back of his hand. "What can I say? They pissed me off." The colonel let out a short laugh, then looked past him at the younglings. "You fought for them." Briggs' smirk faded. He turned, looking back at the children, at the Elden who had barely survived. Then he looked at the battlefield behind him, the fallen enemies, the burning wreckage of what was once their home. Someone had to. The colonel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Get these kids on the ship. We'll get them somewhere safe." As the soldiers moved in, guiding the waiting transports, Briggs took one last look at the ruins of the settlement. It had been just another nameless colony, another casualty of an indifferent galaxy. But now, because of him, because of one man who refused to look away, it was something more. A symbol. A warning. As he stepped onto the drop ship, one of the younglings turned back, watching him with quiet admiration. Briggs met her gaze, offering her a small nod before the ship's doors closed. They had called humanity violent, reckless, and predictable. But today, the galaxy had learned something else about them. When a human decided to fight, truly fight, it wasn't just for themselves. It was for anyone who needed them. And there was no force in the universe that burned brighter than a human's fury when defending the innocent.